Every superstar shines bright on stage, but behind the lights there's always a shadow. And for this artist, that shadow has followed them from the very beginning. To the world, they looked unstoppable. The songs at the top of the charts, the crowds screaming their name, the interviews where they flashed a smile that seemed effortless. But Whispers told a different story. Behind the cameras, behind the glamour, there were signs that not everything was as perfect as it seemed. Friends who noticed strange changes, fans who caught details others missed, rumours that began quietly, spreading like wildfire until they couldn't be ignored anymore. And what makes this story even more chilling is how carefully so much of it was hidden. Every time one truth slipped out, another distraction seemed to appear, as if someone was working overtime to control the narrative. That's the part that keeps people hooked, because the more you look at this journey, the more you realise it isn't just about fame or talent. It's about pressure, it's about secrets, and it's about how easily an image can be manufactured while the person underneath it is falling apart. Some people will tell you they saw the warning signs all along, that the breakdowns, the vanishing acts, and the cryptic messages weren't accidents. Others believe it was all orchestrated, that powerful forces in the industry played a bigger role than anyone dares to admit. Either way, it leaves one question echoing louder than the music itself. What was really happening behind closed doors? Because when you strip away the headlines, the scandals, and the polished image, you're left with a story that doesn't just belong to one artist. It's a story about what fame takes, what it hides, and what it destroys, and the pieces that can never be put back together once the mask finally cracks. Every great story starts somewhere, and for this artist, the beginning wasn't glamorous or headline-worthy. It was raw, uncertain, and filled with the kind of hunger that only comes from growing up with little to fall back on but a dream. Long before the world knew their name, they were just another kid trying to find a voice in a world that often ignored them. They spent nights scribbling lyrics on scraps of paper, recording demos on borrowed equipment, and hustling through small performances that barely paid enough to cover rent. But even then, there was something magnetic about them, something that made people stop, listen, and believe. It wasn't just the sound. It was the way they carried themselves, as if deep down they knew the stage was where they belonged. That quiet confidence mixed with desperation gave them an edge others didn't have, and soon opportunity started knocking. The first real break came almost by accident. A clip of their performance, raw and unpolished, went viral on social media. Overnight they went from local unknown to national curiosity. Blogs started writing about the mysterious new talent. Fans shared the clip with captions like, "The future of music," and industry scouts suddenly found themselves playing catch-up, scrambling to figure out who this person was and how they'd seemingly come out of nowhere. It was the kind of story that feels too cinematic to be true, but that's what made it irresistible. The public loves an underdog, and this was an underdog with charisma to match the hype. Within weeks they were in meetings with major labels, sitting in rooms they had once only dreamed about, facing people who promised the world if they were willing to give everything in return. The rise wasn't slow, it was explosive. One moment they were performing for a crowd of 20 in a half-empty bar. The next they were headlining small tours, opening for names they had grown up idolizing. The pressure was immense, but the fire inside them seemed unshakable. They didn't just want success, they needed it. And every interview they gave during this time reflected that hunger. They spoke about wanting to prove people wrong, about showing that they had more to offer than anyone expected. The media painted them as a prodigy, someone destined to carry the torch of a generation. But behind the headlines and applause, there were cracks beginning to show. The fast rise meant there was no real time to adjust. Friends from their old life noticed the changes. The phone calls grew less frequent. The circle of trust smaller. It wasn't arrogance. It was survival. The industry doesn't give you time to breathe, and they were learning that the hard way. Still, to the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale. Every single they dropped climbed the charts faster than the last. Collaborations with established artists proved they could hold their own with the best. Award shows started inviting them, and suddenly, the kid who once struggled to pay bills was being dressed in designer clothes and walking red carpets. It all seemed too good to be true, and maybe that's because it was. People forget that behind every rising star is a machine, and once the machine starts rolling, there's no turning back. Schedules became relentless. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, with hardly a moment of rest in between. They smiled for cameras, but those close enough could see the exhaustion hiding in their eyes. This wasn't just about passion anymore. It was about keeping up with an image the world had decided they had to live up to. And yet, the rise was intoxicating. They bought their first luxury car, the kind they used to daydream about. They moved into a house so large it felt empty even with friends over. They posted photos that screamed success. Carefully curated snapshots of a life millions envied. Fans worshipped them, critics respected them, and peers began to fear them. There's a moment in every star's journey where they shift from being admired to being watched, and this artist hit that moment sooner than most. Every move they made became newsworthy. Every outfit, every phrase, every subtle facial expression was dissected online. That kind of spotlight does strange things to a person. At first it's thrilling, then it becomes suffocating, and for this artist the suffocation had already begun. But if the pressure was mounting, they didn't let it show. They doubled down, pouring themselves into their craft. The first album was a critical and commercial success, hailed as one of the most impressive debuts in recent memory. The second one only cemented their place in history. Suddenly, they weren't just an artist, they were a cultural force. Their music wasn't just topping charts, it was shaping conversations, soundtracking lives, and dominating playlists across the globe. To the world, this was proof they were unstoppable. But to those who looked closer, there were signs that something wasn't right. Lyrics began to shift, carrying darker undertones. Social media posts grew more cryptic. The once endless enthusiasm in interviews seemed replaced with rehearsed smiles and guarded answers. The rise had brought them everything they once wanted, but at a cost no one saw yet. They were becoming isolated, trapped by the very fame they fought so hard to earn. Industry insiders whispered that they were difficult, unpredictable, even volatile. But what those labels really meant was that they were human, struggling to balance who they really were with who they were being forced to become. The rise had turned them into a symbol, but symbols don't get to be flawed. Symbols don't get to rest. And the weight of carrying that was already starting to eat away at them. Looking back, it's easy to say the warning signs were obvious. The exhaustion, the forced smiles, the way they sometimes seemed absent, even when they were standing on stage in front of thousands. But in the moment, no one wanted to see it. The rise was too spectacular, too inspiring, too profitable. Everyone was invested in the myth of the unstoppable star. And so the cracks were ignored, painted over with makeup and flashing lights, hidden beneath choreographed perfection. But myths don't last forever, and while the world celebrated the rise, the descent was already waiting in the shadows. Because the higher you climb, the harder you fall, and for this artist, the fall would be unlike anything anyone expected. Every star has that moment where everything changes, where success shifts from being a reward to becoming a burden, and for this artist, that turning point came faster than anyone could have predicted. At first, it looked like the natural next step in a storybook rise. Sold-out tours, bigger stages, chart domination, magazine covers, endorsement deals. On the surface, it was the dream. But underneath, the machinery of fame was grinding down piece by piece, and the pressure that once felt thrilling now felt suffocating. The demands grew relentless. Labels wanted more music, managers wanted more appearances, fans wanted constant access. Every move was monetized, every word weighed against potential backlash, and suddenly the dream felt less like freedom and more like a cage with golden bars. The first cracks started to appear during the whirlwind of back-to-back tours. The schedule was brutal, city after city, no time to breathe, let alone process the scale of what was happening. Nights blurred into mornings, interviews stacked on top of rehearsals, rehearsals stacked on top of performances. And while the fans screamed louder with each show, those closest to the artist noticed a different kind of silence. Off stage, their energy dwindled. Smiles seemed more forced, conversation shorter, and moments of solitude stretched longer. They began to retreat, carving out small pockets of privacy wherever they could. Hotel bathrooms, late-night drives, empty dressing rooms. It wasn't selfishness. It was survival. But fame doesn't allow for privacy. Not really. Cameras followed everywhere, and every time they slipped into isolation, rumours filled the gaps. Stories circulated online, acting strange, pulling away from the spotlight, difficult to work with. The public didn't see exhaustion, they saw drama, and the media, always hungry for controversy, began spinning narratives that hinted at instability. Suddenly, the artist wasn't just the brightest new star. They were a headline waiting to implode. This was the moment the industry turned. Instead of celebrating them as a phenomenon, executives started treating them as an investment at risk of losing value. Contracts became stricter, monitoring increased. The very people who promised to protect them were the same ones pushing them harder, expecting more, refusing to acknowledge the toll it was taking. Friends who raised concerns were pushed aside, branded as distractions, and the artist, caught between their own unravelling and the suffocating grip of the industry, had nowhere to run. That's when the first real incident occurred, the moment fans and critics alike realised something was wrong. During a high-profile performance broadcast live to millions, the artist froze mid-song. For nearly 15 seconds they stood motionless, staring blankly into the crowd. The band kept playing, the lights kept flashing, but the voice never came, and when they finally snapped back, it wasn't with a triumphant recovery, it was with a hurried exit. The show ended abruptly, and the headlines the next morning were merciless. Breakdown on stage. Is fame too much for them? Cracks in the facade. The narrative of invincibility was shattered, and with it the artist's ability to hide behind the illusion of control. From there, the pressure only escalated. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every slip magnified. Paparazzi photos were dissected for signs of weakness. A tired face became evidence of addiction. A quiet expression became proof of depression. Fans argued online, torn between defending their idol and fearing the worst. Meanwhile, whispers spread in the industry about missed deadlines, cancelled studio sessions, and heated fights behind closed doors. The more the artist pulled away, the more people leaned in, desperate to uncover what was happening behind the curtain. And this was the true turning point, when the person became less important than the spectacle. They were no longer allowed to simply be human. They had become a character in a story written by others, a story of struggle, collapse, and potential redemption. The audience wanted drama as much as music, and the industry fed that hunger because controversy sold just as well as hit singles. For the artist, this was the moment the dream curdled into a nightmare. Fame no longer felt like a gift, it felt like surveillance. Every stumble was content, every breakdown was a headline. Still, the artist tried to push forward. They returned to the studio, determined to prove they were still in control. The songs that came out of those sessions, however, were darker than anything they'd written before. The lyrics carried a weight, hinting at battles no one could see, at demons that lived behind closed doors. Fans praised the honesty. Critics called it a bold artistic shift. But those closest to the artist recognized the truth. These weren't just songs. They were cries for help disguised as art. But in an industry built on profit, pain was just another commodity. If the music sold, no one wanted to ask what it cost to create. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, there was still brilliance. The turning point didn't erase the talent, it amplified it. Performances, though more unpredictable, carried a raw intensity that audiences couldn't look away from. Every note felt like it might be the last, every lyric like a confession, and that danger, that sense of unravelling, made them magnetic. People couldn't decide if they were watching a star at the height of their powers or the beginning of a collapse, but either way they couldn't look away. What makes this chapter of their story so haunting is the duality. Success and suffering, triumph and collapse, fame and isolation, all colliding in real time. They were achieving everything they once dreamed of, but it no longer felt like victory. It felt like survival. And survival wasn't guaranteed. The turning point wasn't just about fame changing them. It was about fame consuming them, reshaping them into someone they barely recognized. This was the point where fans began to whisper, what's really happening behind the scenes? Why does someone with everything look like they're losing everything? Why do the brightest stars always seem to burn out the fastest? Because the truth is, the turning point doesn't happen when the music stops selling or the crowd stop cheering. It happens when the person behind the image realizes that no matter how high they climb, they can't escape the weight of the machine that got them there. And for this artist, that realization was devastating. The fame they chased, the dream they sacrificed everything for. had turned into the very thing that threatened to destroy them. The turning point wasn't just a moment, it was the beginning of the unravelling. And as much as the world wanted to believe the story could still have a happy ending, the signs were already there. Something was breaking, and it wasn't going to be fixed with another hit single or another tour. The question wasn't if the fall would come, the question was how soon. Every headline painted the picture of someone untouchable, but behind the glossy photo shoots and thunderous applause was a person fighting battles no award could ever heal. The hidden struggles began quietly, so quietly that even those closest didn't recognize them for what they were. At first, it looked like fatigue, the natural toll of long tours and endless press circuits. But fatigue doesn't hollow your eyes, and it doesn't twist lyrics into coded cries for help. What was happening went deeper, something heavier gnawing at them long before the cameras noticed. The truth is, the rise to stardom came with sacrifices the world never saw. Friendships abandoned, family ties stretched thin, nights spent in hotel rooms where silence screamed louder than applause. They had achieved the dream, but they were lonelier than ever. The industry loves to paint fame as the cure to every problem: money, recognition, validation. But it doesn't mention the way it magnifies insecurities, the way it forces performers to wear masks that grow heavier each day. And for this artist, the mask was beginning to crack. Rumours began to swirl: late-night disappearances, cancelled meetings, unexplained absences. Their team brushed it all off with excuses: exhaustion, scheduling conflicts, creative breaks. But whispers have a way of growing louder. Fans noticed cryptic posts on social media, captions that didn't match the glossy photos, emojis that carried double meanings, references to shadows, fire, and drowning. Some dismissed them as artistic expression, but others knew better. These weren't metaphors, these were messages. Behind the scenes, their struggles were no longer whispers but storms. Sleepless nights turned into weeks of insomnia. Studio sessions stretched into early mornings where nothing was recorded but frustration. Collaborators described them as distant, sometimes disappearing mid-session without explanation. Friends confided later that their conversations became fragmented, drifting between bursts of laughter and sudden silence. It was as if they were carrying a weight no one could see, and the effort of hiding it was draining whatever energy they had left. Then came the unhealthy coping mechanisms, the ways they tried to numb the constant pressure. For some stars, it's the endless party; for others, isolation. In their case, it was both. Long nights lost in clubs followed by days locked away in dark rooms. The cycle became predictable, but no one around them dared to call it what it was. The industry thrives on denial. If the music gets made, if the shows keep selling, if the fans keep screaming, then the struggles are swept under the rug. But denial only delays the inevitable, and every day, the storm inside them grew stronger. It wasn't just the weight of fame, it was the ghosts from before fame ever arrived. People forget that stars don't start fresh when they enter the spotlight. They carry childhood wounds, broken families, lost friendships, and personal traumas just like anyone else. But once fame arrives, those wounds get buried under glitter and spotlight. For this artist, the ghosts came back louder than ever. Old stories resurfaced in interviews. Journalists dug into their past, pulling skeletons out of closets they had never agreed to open. Headlines reduced their pain into clickbait, treating trauma like entertainment. And the more those wounds were exposed, the deeper they cut. Privately, those around them began to worry. Close friends described mood swings, bursts of anger followed by crushing guilt. One moment they were the life of the room, the next they vanished without a word. Industry insiders talked about cancelled flights, meetings missed, interviews that ended abruptly. But none of it reached the public in full. The machine worked overtime to polish the image, releasing carefully crafted statements and photo ops to drown out the reality. Still, fans could feel something wasn't right. They weren't blind. They saw the emptiness behind the smiles, the vacant look in photos where joy used to radiate, and then came the songs, darker, heavier, layered with lyrics that hinted at breaking points. Lines about drowning in silence, being trapped behind walls, shadows whispering in the night. To casual listeners it was poetic, but to those who paid attention, it was a confession. They weren't singing about characters or fiction, they were singing about themselves. the music became the only place they could bleed without judgment, and even then, the world clapped, cheered, and demanded more, not realizing they were applauding someone's unraveling. Rumours of breakdowns spread, and fans began piecing together theories. Some speculated about feuds with management, others about family conflicts, others still about battles with inner demons no one wanted to name directly. And through it all, the artist stayed silent, speaking only through fragmented lyrics and fleeting appearances. The silence was louder than any statement. Silence, after all, is hard to spin. But the most chilling part of their hidden struggles was how much of it unfolded in plain sight. Videos surfaced of concerts where they seemed disconnected, their voice breaking, eyes staring past the crowd into nothingness. Clips went viral showing them stumbling through paparazzi swarms, muttering words no one could understand. Fans debated whether it was exhaustion or something darker. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds, some defending their idol, others insisting the star was spiralling. Everyone had an opinion. No one had the truth, because the truth was locked behind closed doors, and behind those doors, the star was losing battles no one could fight for them. Personal relationships crumbled, trust eroded. People they once leaned on began to back away, unsure how to help or unwilling to risk their own careers by staying close. Fame is fickle, and when cracks appear, the vultures circle fast. Gossip blogs feasted on every stumble, tabloids exaggerated every rumour. And through it all, the star was left increasingly isolated, trapped between being idolised and being torn apart. That's the cruelest irony of fame. The world puts you on a pedestal, then watches gleefully as you teeter on the edge. And for this artist, the hidden struggles weren't just about personal demons. They were about carrying the unbearable weight of being seen by millions but truly understood by none. They had become both everywhere and nowhere at once, a global icon and a lonely soul. And while the public speculated, the spiral deepened. Every sleepless night carved deeper lines into their face. Every forced smile felt more brittle. Every performance became a gamble. Would they shine, or would the facade finally crack on stage? Fans didn't know. Managers didn't care. The machine kept moving forward, chewing up the person in service of the brand. But nothing hidden stays hidden forever. And these struggles, buried beneath contracts, image and denial, were about to explode into the open in ways no one could ignore. Because whispers turn into screams, and once the world sees the cracks, the fall is no longer a question of if, but when. Rumours are the lifeblood of fame, and for this artist they became chains. Long before the truth ever surfaced, whispers spread like wildfire, carried through forums, tabloids, and social media accounts that claimed to have inside sources. At first the rumours were harmless, questions about who they were dating, what they were like off stage, how they spent their money. But as the spotlight grew harsher, the whispers turned darker. People began suggesting things that went far beyond curiosity, painting pictures of chaos and scandal without a shred of proof. And the worst part? Rumours don't need proof, they only need attention. And attention was something this artist had in endless supply. The first wave came during a hiatus, a few weeks where they vanished from the public eye. To fans it seemed like a well-earned break, but the tabloids turned silence into scandal. Stories surfaced about secret rehab visits, about wild parties hidden away in mansions, about heated feuds with industry insiders. None of it could be confirmed, but none of it needed to be. A single anonymous tip was enough to spawn dozens of articles, each twisting the narrative until people believed absence meant downfall. Even when the artist returned, smiling and working, the shadow of those rumours lingered. Every smile looked fake, every appearance was seen as a cover-up. Then came the rumours about relationships, flings with other stars, betrayals between friends, whispered stories of affairs that turned into betrayals. Social media amplified every rumour 1,000 times over. A photo taken out of context became proof of cheating. A vague lyric in a song became confirmation of heartbreak. Fans dissected every post, every tweet, every facial expression, until narratives were written without a single word from the artists themselves. And once fans divided into sides, the rumours became wars. Hashtags trended daily, Some defending, some accusing, all feeding into a spectacle the media was more than happy to monetize. But the most dangerous rumours weren't about love. They were about survival. Whispers began to circulate about erratic behaviour backstage, about violent outbursts in hotel rooms, about substances fueling the late nights, and chaotic energy. Some claimed to have seen the star stumbling through airports. Others insisted they were carried out of clubs. Videos surfaced, grainy, shaky clips of someone who looked like them, though often too blurry to prove anything. Still, perception didn't need clarity. The more the clips spread, the more people accepted the narrative, and as the narrative grew, so did the belief that the star was spiralling out of control. Behind closed doors, managers and executives knew rumours were dangerous, but also useful. As long as people were talking, the star's name stayed relevant. Controversy sold tickets, drove streams, kept them trending. The industry has always thrived on spectacle, and if the spectacle came from whispers instead of music, so be it. To them, a rumour was just another form of marketing, but to the artist, it was poison. They could feel their truth slipping away, replaced by 1,000 fabricated versions of themselves that strangers debated online as if they owned the story. Every rumour chipped away at their identity until even they began to wonder where the lie ended and the truth began. And then the betrayal rumours started. Former friends leaked stories, ex-collaborators gave cryptic interviews, anonymous insiders claimed the star was impossible to work with. Money disputes surfaced, tales of contracts broken, projects scrapped, trust shattered. Some stories were exaggerated, others completely false, but once the seed was planted, the world treated them as gospel. Headlines declared the star had turned on their closest allies. Fans speculated about who was guilty, who was innocent, who was lying, who was telling the truth. And through it all, the star remained silent, knowing that anything they said would only pour gasoline on the fire. Silence, however, was its own weapon. In the absence of answers, speculation filled the void. Fans demanded statements, the press demanded confessions, and the lack of either became proof of guilt. Soon, rumours weren't just stories, they became reality. Bookings were cancelled because of concerns. Brand deals vanished without explanation. Collaborations dried up as artists distanced themselves, afraid of being pulled into the storm. It didn't matter what was true anymore. The rumours had become more powerful than the facts. And yet, the artists couldn't escape them. Every time they logged online, their name was trending, attached to another scandal, another accusation, another conspiracy. Fans claimed to know what was happening behind closed doors, piecing together theories out of nothing more than body language and Instagram captions. Some believed they were being controlled by their label. Others were convinced they were sending coded messages through lyrics, crying out for help. A few whispered about even darker possibilities, that they were trapped, manipulated or silenced by forces much bigger than themselves. The theories blurred the line between concern and obsession until it became impossible to tell who cared and who was just entertained. The cruelest rumours were the ones about their mental state. Words like unstable, paranoid, and dangerous floated through interviews and online posts. Strangers debated whether they were fit to perform, whether they should be hospitalised, whether their career was already over. Every stumble became evidence, every tired expression confirmation. The world dissected their humanity like it was a puzzle to solve, forgetting that the person at the centre of it was living every day under the crushing weight of those assumptions. And the worst part? Rumours don't fade, they evolve. One story dies down, and another rises in its place. By the time one scandal was debunked, two more had taken root. It was a cycle without end, and the artist was caught in it with no escape. Every attempt to move forward was sabotaged by the shadows of lies they never asked for. Even victories, new music, new performances, small moments of joy, were overshadowed by whispers that it was all just a facade. But the rumours weren't just damaging their career, they were breaking them down as a person. How do you fight lies when the world refuses to hear the truth? How do you hold on to your identity when millions of strangers are rewriting it every single day? That's the silent torment of celebrity, the way gossip becomes gospel and gossip becomes identity. The artist who once commanded stages now felt powerless against narratives they couldn't control, and as the rumours deepened, one truth became clear: something was about to give. No one can carry the weight of the world's lies forever, and for this artist, the pressure wasn't just unbearable, it was dangerous. Because when the world insists you're falling apart sometimes, it becomes impossible not to. The rumours weren't just stories, they were the cracks in the foundation, and soon the foundation would collapse. The spiral never happens all at once. It creeps in slowly, a shadow at the edge of the spotlight, waiting for the moment when the cheering fades and the silence grows too loud. For this artist, the spiral began as whispers of exhaustion and stretched into something darker, something impossible to ignore. To the public it seemed sudden. One moment they were everywhere, unstoppable, and the next they were stumbling through interviews, cancelling shows, posting cryptic messages that left fans scrambling to decode meaning. But the truth is, the spiral had been building for years, and by the time the world finally noticed, it was already too late. The late nights became longer, the mornings harder to face. At first, the disappearances were explained away, creative breaks, time to recharge, the usual excuses. But the frequency of those absences grew, and soon the silence began to speak louder than any statement. Fans begged for reassurance, tabloids filled the gaps with scandal, and all the while, the star seemed to slip further into shadows. Insiders whispered about chaotic backstage scenes, fights with managers, long stretches of silence in dressing rooms, entire shows nearly cancelled because they refused to come out. And when they did, it was often with eyes that seemed distant, body language stiff, as if they were going through the motions rather than living in the moment. Social media, once their playground, became a battleground. Posts grew erratic, sometimes disappearing minutes after they were uploaded, sometimes filled with cryptic language about shadows, endings, and people wearing masks. Fans tried to decode every word, treating each post like a puzzle. Some insisted the star was crying for help. Others argued it was just performance art, a marketing tactic, another layer of the brand. But those closest to the spiral knew it wasn't art. It was pain bleeding through the cracks of carefully built walls. The public collapse began with small incidents. A missed award show appearance, a red carpet moment where they stared blankly into cameras instead of flashing their usual smile, a performance where they forgot entire verses of their own songs. Each incident sparked a new round of speculation, new hashtags, new debates about whether they were on the brink of losing everything. The spiral fed itself. The more the world obsessed over their downfall, the harder it became for them to find footing. And when the world insists you're broken long enough, eventually you begin to believe it. Behind closed doors, things grew worse. Friends described unpredictable mood swings, bursts of energy followed by days of silence, laughter that turned to tears without warning. Creative sessions turned into long nights staring at blank pages, frustrated outbursts or complete shutdowns. Collaborators grew cautious, unsure of how to navigate the unpredictable storms. Managers grew impatient, pushing harder, demanding results even as the spiral deepened. To the industry, the artist wasn't a person. They were a product slipping in value. And when a product slips, pressure increases, even if that pressure is what's crushing it in the first place. Fans began noticing disturbing details in the few public appearances that remained. Shaking hands during interviews, clothes that looked dishevelled, like they had been thrown on at the last second. Long pauses before answering questions. A stare that drifted past the cameras into nothingness. Some fans defended them, saying they were just tired. Others weren't so sure. The internet became flooded with theories. Was it burnout, substance abuse, a breakdown, or something darker? Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion added weight to the spiral. What makes the spiral so haunting is how public it became. Paparazzi photos showed them stumbling late at night, shielding their face, sometimes muttering under their breath. Videos surfaced of them storming out of clubs, leaving cars abruptly, shouting at figures no one else could see. Whether these were real symptoms of unravelling or just moments taken out of context no longer mattered. The narrative was written, the star was spiralling, and the world was watching. But the darkest moments were the ones the cameras didn't capture. Confidants later spoke of nights filled with paranoia, of them pacing hotel rooms, convinced they were being watched, convinced people around them were hiding secrets. They began pushing away even their closest friends, accusing them of betrayal, of feeding the rumours rather than protecting them. Isolation deepened. Trust eroded. And in that isolation, the spiral grew uncontrollable. The music shifted too. New tracks leaked, unfinished, raw, and almost painful to hear. Gone were the polished hooks and triumphant anthems. In their place were distorted sounds, lyrics drenched in imagery of drowning, falling, disappearing. To some fans, it was the boldest art of their career. To others, it was a clear sign something was deeply wrong. Either way, the songs felt less like entertainment and more like confessions, pieces of a puzzle the star was desperate for someone to solve. The spiral turned performances into gambles. Some nights they shined, pouring raw emotion into every note, leaving audiences breathless. Other nights they barely made it through, mumbling lyrics, forgetting steps, sometimes walking off before the show ended. Fans left confused, torn between admiration and worry. Was this authenticity or collapse? Was the artist evolving, or was the spiral consuming them before their eyes? And then came the disappearances. Entire weeks went by without a single sighting, no posts, no interviews, no paparazzi captures. Fans launched campaigns demanding answers. Rumours flew about rehab stays, secret hospital visits, conflicts with management. Every silence sparked louder noise, until the absence became a story in itself, and when they finally resurfaced, the return didn't ease concerns, it only deepened them. Gaunt, quiet, and distant, they appeared like someone still lost in the shadows, not someone who had found a way out. The spiral fed on itself, creating a cycle that seemed impossible to break. The more they struggled, the more the world gossiped. The more the world gossiped, the more they withdrew. And with each withdrawal, the rumours grew darker, the pressure heavier, the isolation deeper. Fame, once a dream, had become a magnifying glass burning them alive. The saddest part of the spiral wasn't just watching a star crumble, it was realising how many people profited from the spectacle. Every stumble sold magazines, every breakdown boosted clicks. Every whispered rumour kept their name trending. The spiral wasn't just personal, it was public property. And while the artist was losing themselves piece by piece, the world treated their pain like a show. But spirals don't last forever. They end in one of two ways, redemption or collapse. And as this one deepened, the world began to ask, which way will it go? Could the star claw their way back from the shadows, or was the spiral too strong to escape? At this stage, no one had the answer. Not the fans, not the managers, not even the artists themselves. All anyone knew was that the spiral was real, and it was pulling them deeper every day. And the question wasn't just whether they would survive. The question was whether the world would let them. The world loves to see stars rise, but it loves even more to watch them fall. And while fans debate, tabloids speculate, and social media tears someone apart piece by piece, there's always one silent player in the background, shaping the story with invisible hands, the industry. For this artist, the industry wasn't just a backdrop. It was the machine that built their image, controlled their moves, and ultimately profited from every stumble. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that the spiral wasn't just personal. It was systemic. From the very beginning, the industry saw them as a product, not a person. That's the brutal truth no one says out loud. Talent is the spark, but the machine is what turns that spark into profit. Labels pour money into building a persona, crafting an image so spotless, or so scandalous, that it can be packaged and sold to millions. And once that persona takes root, the person behind it is expected to disappear. For this artist, the image was carefully designed, glamorous but relatable, edgy but marketable, vulnerable enough to feel human but polished enough to look perfect. Every interview was scripted, every appearance staged, every tweet weighed against market value. The illusion was airtight, but illusions crack eventually. And when cracks appeared, the machine didn't try to repair them, it exploited them. The first sign of trouble came during their touring years, when exhaustion began to show. Any other job would allow for rest, recovery, a pause to breathe. But in the music industry, the answer to burnout isn't rest, it's reinvention. Managers booked more appearances, labels demanded more singles, PR teams spun exhaustion into dedication. The spiral was reframed as a brand. If they stumbled, It was proof they were giving their all. If they disappeared, it was mystery to keep fans hooked. Every breakdown became a headline, and every headline became revenue. The machine didn't just tolerate the spiral, it profited from it. Behind closed doors, executives argued not about how to protect the artist, but how to protect the investment. Contracts tightened, ensuring obligations were met no matter the personal cost. NDAs kept damaging stories from leaking, but only when it benefited the label. If a rumour could be spun into buzz, it was allowed to run wild. Image consultants rebranded every mistake as part of the narrative. Even the artist's struggles became content, fodder for songs, interviews, documentaries. Pain was packaged as authenticity, and authenticity sold records. The industry has always thrived on control, and for this artist that control became suffocating. Every attempt to step back was met with pushback. Attempts to take creative risks were dismissed unless they aligned with market trends. Even personal choices, friends, partners, public statements, were filtered through handlers who decided what was on brand. And when the artist began to resist, to demand more freedom, the machine responded with subtle punishments. Projects delayed, budgets cut, opportunities mysteriously slipping away. It was a reminder that in the industry, power doesn't belong to the talent, it belongs to the gatekeepers, and yet the same gatekeepers who controlled every aspect of their career were the ones who ignored the obvious signs of collapse. Managers who saw the insomnia, the erratic behaviour, the paranoia, still pushed them on stage. Publicists who heard their private pleas for help silenced them with warnings about hurting the brand. Executives who cashed in on their pain justified it with one simple phrase: it's the price of fame. But fame shouldn't cost someone their humanity. Still, in an industry built on profit, humanity comes second. What makes the industry's role even darker is how it manipulates perception. When the spiral grew too public to hide, the machine didn't try to stop it, it tried to control the story. Carefully crafted statements painted collapses as artistic evolution. Hospital visits were framed as routine exhaustion. Social media silence was turned into mystique. The truth wasn't important. What mattered was keeping the narrative alive, because the narrative kept the money flowing. And the cruelest twist: even when fans demanded answers, transparency was never the goal. Confusion sells just as well as clarity. The more people speculated, the more attention the star received, and attention was the currency the industry thrived on. But the industry's role wasn't just about exploitation, it was about isolation. By surrounding the artist with handlers, lawyers, consultants, and managers, the machine made sure every personal relationship was filtered, every voice carefully chosen. Friends who raised concerns were pushed out. Family members who questioned the pace were denied access. The tighter the machine's grip, the lonelier the artist became, and loneliness is the perfect soil for a spiral to grow. By the time the star realized how trapped they were, the walls were already too high to climb. The most chilling part is that this isn't unique. History is filled with stars who've been pushed past their breaking point while the industry watched. Some survived, clawing their way back to freedom. Others didn't. And in each case, the pattern repeats. The machine builds them up, milks every ounce of their energy, and discards them when the cracks become too deep to hide. For this artist, the spiral wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a system designed to prioritize profit over people. And yet, fans rarely see this side. They see the music, the glamour, the interviews, the curated posts. They don't see the contracts that dictate every move, the managers who calculate every statement, the executives who decide whether an artist eats, sleeps, or performs. And when the spiral happens, the blame is always placed on the artist. They're called unstable, difficult, reckless. The industry walks away clean, painting itself as the victim of an unpredictable star, when in reality, it was pulling the strings all along. The spiral may have been personal, but it wasn't private. It was engineered, accelerated, and exploited by the same people who swore they were building a legacy. And as the artist slipped deeper, the industry simply adjusted the narrative, preparing to squeeze one last drop of profit from their pain. That's the brutal reality of fame. It's not just a dream. It's a machine. And once you're inside, it doesn't care who you are, only what you're worth. The industry didn't just watch the spiral, it wrote it. And as the world kept speculating, As rumours spread and fans debated, the question hung in the air. Was this collapse truly inevitable? Or could it have been prevented if the machine cared more about the person than the product? The answer is simple, but the machine doesn't like simple answers, because in the end, tragedy sells too. Every storm builds until it breaks, and for this artist, the breaking point wasn't a single moment, but a collision of years of pressure, silence, and pain exploding all at once. The signs had been there for months, missed rehearsals, cryptic social posts, shaky performances, but the machine kept pushing forward. The public kept demanding more, and the whispers kept growing louder. When the collapse finally came, it felt both shocking and inevitable, like watching a tower topple after the cracks had been ignored for too long. And what made it even more haunting was that it happened in plain sight, in front of the very world that had built them up. The breaking point began during a tour that was supposed to mark their grand comeback. Tickets sold out within hours, anticipation was higher than ever, and fans believed this was the moment their idol would reclaim control. But behind the scenes, the pressure was unbearable. Long rehearsals left them drained. Backstage arguments grew heated, with managers insisting on perfection, while the artist begged for space. They were running on fumes, and yet the schedule left no room for rest. Each night they stepped onto the stage with the weight of the world pressing on their chest, forcing a smile, forcing energy, forcing themselves to keep going. But cracks can't stay hidden forever. It happened mid-performance, in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans. At first, it was subtle. A stumble, a missed lyric, a pause too long to be ignored. The band kept playing, the crowd kept cheering, but the star froze, eyes glazed, staring out into the sea of faces as if lost in another world. Seconds stretched like hours. The music carried on without them, until suddenly they dropped the mic, turned, and walked off stage. The show ended abruptly, leaving fans in stunned silence. Videos of the moment flooded social media within minutes. Headlines declared it a breakdown, a collapse, a disaster, and for once, the machine couldn't spin it away. The breaking point had arrived. In the days that followed, speculation reached a fever pitch. Some fans defended them, saying exhaustion had finally caught up. Others whispered darker theories, substances, mental breakdowns, even conspiracies about sabotage. The media feasted on every angle, plastering their face across every front page, dissecting every frame of the footage. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds, one side pleading for compassion, the other mocking the collapse as entertainment. And while the world debated, the artist disappeared. No statements, no posts, no sightings, just silence. Behind the silence, the truth was darker than anyone knew. Friends later revealed that the breaking point wasn't just about one show. It was about everything. Years of bottled-up pain, of being controlled, of losing their identity piece by piece. That night on stage was simply the moment the facade shattered, the mask slipping too far to be fixed. Away from cameras, they broke down completely, sobbing, shaking, collapsing into exhaustion. Doctors were called, management scrambled. Contracts were rewritten. But none of that addressed the root problem. The artist had finally hit a wall they couldn't push through. And yet, the machine tried. Within days, PR teams drafted statements about exhaustion and the need for rest. Tour dates were postponed but not cancelled, as if recovery could be scheduled into a calendar. Behind the scenes, executives debated whether the brand could survive the scandal. Some wanted to pull them off everything, cut losses and move on. Others argued that the breakdown could be spun into a redemption arc. After all, nothing sells like a comeback from tragedy. The breaking point wasn't seen as a human collapse. It was seen as content. But for the artist, it wasn't content. It was survival. Those close to them described days spent in silence, locked in dark rooms, refusing to eat or speak. Nights filled with paranoia, pacing, muttering about people watching them, controlling them, using them. Sleep became impossible. Trust dissolved completely. Even those who genuinely cared were pushed away, accused of betrayal. The breaking point had stripped away whatever walls of resilience they had left, leaving only raw, unfiltered pain. And the cruelest part? Even in collapse, they weren't allowed peace. Paparazzi camped outside homes, hospitals, and studios snapping photos of every glimpse. Grainy shots of them looking frail fueled new headlines. Unrecognizable, broken, a shadow of their former self. Tabloids speculated about rehab, about suicide attempts, about feuds with family. None of it could be confirmed, but confirmation wasn't necessary. The world consumed the tragedy like a spectacle, and the artist became both victim and villain in a story they never asked to be written. Fans began to fracture too. Some launched campaigns begging for compassion, trending hashtags about giving the star privacy. Others turned on them completely, angry at cancelled shows, demanding refunds, accusing them of being ungrateful. The same voices that once screamed their name in adoration now spit accusations of weakness, selfishness, and failure. Fame is fickle, and the breaking point proved just how quickly adoration can turn into condemnation. But breaking points also reveal truths that can't be hidden anymore. For years, the artist had hinted at their struggles through lyrics, cryptic posts, and fleeting interviews. Now, the world could no longer deny it. The breaking point wasn't a spectacle. It was a scream for help, for freedom, for humanity in an industry that had stripped all of that away. Whether the world listened, however, was another question, and yet within the collapse there were flashes of resilience. Friends described moments where the artist spoke about wanting to take control, to break free from contracts, to rebuild life on their own terms. These moments were fragile, often drowned out by the weight of paranoia and exhaustion, but they existed. And that's what made the breaking point so complicated. It wasn't just an end, it was also a potential beginning, a chance to reset, to rebuild, to choose life over image. But whether the machine would allow that was another matter, because while the breaking point exposed the cracks, the industry was already plotting its next move. Redemption arcs sell, comebacks sell, documentaries about collapse and recovery sell. The breaking point, as tragic as it was, had market value, and for an industry built on profit, market value always wins. The question wasn't whether the artist would recover, it was how quickly they could be packaged into a narrative of survival that fans could consume. For the artist, however, the breaking point meant something entirely different. It meant looking in the mirror and realizing they no longer recognized the person staring back. It meant acknowledging that the life they thought they wanted had destroyed them. It meant confronting the reality that unless something changed, there might not be a future at all. And that's the chilling part about the breaking point. It's not the end of the story. It's the moment when the story splits, toward redemption or toward tragedy, toward survival or toward collapse, toward freedom or toward chains. For this artist, the breaking point was both destruction and revelation. It tore down everything they had built, but it also exposed the truth they could no longer deny. They couldn't keep living like this. The only question left was whether the world, and the machine, would let them choose a different path. The breaking point may have shattered the illusion, but the fallout was its own storm. When the mask finally cracked, the world didn't look away. It leaned in closer. Fans, media, and the industry all wanted answers, and every answer became another piece of the spectacle. The fallout wasn't just about recovery or collapse. It was about survival in a world that refused to let the star disappear quietly. Because when someone has been turned into a commodity, even their pain becomes currency. And this fallout was worth millions. The first wave came from the media. Within hours of the breakdown, articles flooded every corner of the internet. Some framed it as tragedy, others as drama, but all of them agreed on one thing: the star was spiraling. Talk shows dissected the footage, psychologists were brought on as guests to speculate about their mental state, and entertainment pundits debated whether their career was salvageable. Headlines screamed words like unstable, erratic, unhinged. Even when framed with fake sympathy, the underlying tone was clear. This wasn't just news, it was entertainment, and the world was watching. Fans, meanwhile, fractured into factions. Some rallied with compassion, trending hashtags calling for privacy, sending messages of love, begging the world to give their idol space. Others lashed out, venting frustration over cancelled shows, lost money, and broken promises. The very people who once screamed their name at concerts now accused them of being selfish, ungrateful, even manipulative. Social media became a battlefield where every post, every rumour, every blurry photo became ammunition. And the cruel truth was that even the fans who meant well often made things worse. Their obsession for answers, their constant speculation, their hunger for updates kept the spotlight burning, even when the star desperately needed darkness. The industry's response was colder, more calculated. Behind closed doors, executives weren't asking, "Are they okay?" They were asking, "Can the brand survive?" Contracts were reviewed, insurance policies examined, future projects debated. Some pushed for pulling back entirely, worried that the damage was irreparable. Others saw opportunity. The collapse could be spun into a redemption story, a comeback arc that would sell records, tickets, and documentaries. The fallout wasn't a question of humanity, it was a business decision. And once again, the star's pain was a product. In the middle of all this noise, the star vanished from public view. Weeks passed without sightings. Rumours filled the silence. Some claimed they were in rehab. Others swore they had been hospitalized. Conspiracies spread that they were under house arrest by their label, silenced to protect the brand. Each theory only fueled the fire, making the fallout even bigger. And the more they tried to hide, the more the world demanded proof they were alive. Privacy, in the wake of collapse, became impossible. But the real fallout wasn't just in the public eye, it was personal. Friends and family who once stood close began to drift away, unsure how to navigate the chaos. Some were pushed out intentionally, accused of betrayal or exploitation. Others pulled back quietly, unwilling to endure the circus that surrounded the star. Isolation deepened. Trust eroded further. And in that isolation, the star's sense of self fractured even more. The fallout wasn't just about repairing a career. It was about trying to remember who they were without the cameras, the contracts, the headlines. And yet, the machine refused to let go. Within months, whispers of a comeback began. Anonymous sources leaked to tabloids that the star was doing better, working on new music, preparing to tell their side of the story. Carefully staged paparazzi photos began to surface. The star walking into a studio, grabbing coffee, looking frail but determined. These images weren't accidents. They were orchestrated. The machine was already building the narrative of recovery, planting seeds for a redemption arc fans could rally behind. The fallout wasn't an ending, it was the setup for the next chapter, but for the star, recovery was anything but simple. Every step forward was haunted by fear. Fear of the spotlight, fear of betrayal, fear that another collapse was inevitable. Therapy sessions dug up old wounds, managers pressured for timelines, fans demanded proof of healing. The pressure to bounce back became just as suffocating as the pressure that caused the breakdown in the first place. And yet, the industry refused to slow down. A comeback wasn't just desired, it was required. This tension defined the fallout. On one side was a human being, broken, trying to piece themselves together. On the other side was an empire built on their name, desperate to keep the money flowing. Every decision, when to reappear, what to say, how to act, was filtered through that clash. Too vulnerable, and people would see weakness. Too strong, and people would accuse them of faking it. Every move was a trap, and there was no way to win. The fallout also exposed truths the world had ignored. Stories leaked about how long the spiral had been visible behind the scenes, how managers had pushed them past exhaustion, how executives had ignored warning signs. Whistleblowers spoke of cancelled interventions, of handlers silencing concerns, of profit being placed above health. The machine was suddenly painted as the villain, but even then, the outrage was temporary. Fans raged online, hashtags trended, but the industry didn't change. It simply adjusted its script. Tragedy sells, redemption sells. Nothing ever truly threatens the machine. And so, the fallout became a limbo. The star was alive but not living, famous but absent, watched but voiceless. Their identity had been broken into fragments. The idol fans still worshipped, the cautionary tale tabloids exploited, the product the industry manipulated, and the person trapped beneath it all. And no matter how hard they tried, those fragments never fit together neatly again. The most haunting part of the fallout was how normal it seemed. History is full of stars who've walked this same path, built up, broken down, repackaged as redemption stories. The cycle is so familiar it feels scripted. And for this artist, the fallout was proof that they were no longer just living their own life. They were living a narrative that belonged to everyone else. But fallout isn't forever. Eventually the noise begins to fade, the headlines slow, the hashtags vanish. What remains is quieter but heavier, the question of what comes next. Do they rebuild, reclaiming control at the cost of defying the machine, or do they surrender, letting the cycle continue until it destroys them completely? That was the choice waiting for this star in the aftermath of collapse. And it was a choice no one else could make for them, because the fallout may have left them broken, but it also left them at a crossroads, and every story that led here, the rise, the spiral, the breaking point, had been written by others. But what came next? That part was theirs. The world loves nothing more than a comeback story, and for this artist the attempted return was as much a performance as any song or show they had ever given. After months of silence, speculation and chaos, the whispers began. New music, new projects, new appearances. The narrative was carefully constructed by the machine. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a redemption arc. Fans who once mourned their downfall clung to hope, hungry to believe their idol could rise from the ashes. But behind the glossy headlines and rehearsed interviews, the comeback was far from simple. It wasn't just about reclaiming a career, it was about reclaiming a self that had been shattered, commodified, and almost destroyed. The first step came with a staged reappearance, a carefully chosen event. Not too grand, but not too small, just enough to make the world notice. They arrived looking fragile yet polished, dressed not in the extravagant costumes of their peak, but in something understated, designed to say, "I'm still here, I'm human, I've been through it, but I'm not gone." Cameras flashed, microphones swarmed, and for the first time in months their voice was heard in public. The words were scripted, gratitude for support, vague acknowledgements of struggles, promises of a brighter future. It was exactly what the machine wanted, a sound bite to restart the engine, a clip to circulate across platforms, proof that the product was still alive. But for the star it was terrifying. Standing in front of cameras again felt like walking into fire. Every flash reminded them of scrutiny, every question reminded them of betrayal. And though they smiled, though they thanked, though they promised, inside they were trembling, barely holding it together. The comeback wasn't healing. It was survival. Soon after came the music. A single was released, dripping with vulnerability, its lyrics raw and confessional. Fans hailed it as a masterpiece, the sound of an artist bearing their soul. Critics praised the honesty, calling it their best work yet. But few realized how much of that honesty had been filtered through marketing teams and PR strategies. The song was real. Yes, born from pain and collapse, but its release was orchestrated to perfection. Every interview about it was rehearsed, every word measured, every performance staged to evoke sympathy and admiration. The machine had taken their suffering and repackaged it into a product, and the world devoured it without hesitation. The comeback tour followed. Smaller venues at first, framed as intimate shows, but really designed to test whether the star could still draw crowds. Tickets sold out instantly. Fans wept in the front rows, singing every lyric, holding signs that read, "We believe in you." The performances were uneven. Some nights, they radiated brilliance, channeling pain into raw power that electrified the stage. Other nights, the cracks showed. Shaky vocals, missed steps, eyes drifting away as if haunted by something unseen. But fans didn't care. Every flaw was reframed as authenticity, every stumble as proof of resilience. The audience wasn't just there for the music. They were there to witness a resurrection. And yet, the comeback was fragile. Behind the curtain, the same pressures loomed. Managers still pushed for more. Labels still demanded perfection. Media still dissected every move, ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. The star was caught in the same cycle they had broken from, only this time with less strength and more scars. Recovery doesn't follow a script, but the industry demanded one. And so, every step of healing was rushed, repackaged, monetized. They weren't given space to breathe, they were given deadlines. Still, there were moments of genuine triumph. Songs that captured the pain with piercing honesty. Shows where their voice soared, leaving fans in tears. Appearances where, for a fleeting second, their smile looked real. These moments hinted at the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the comeback could be more than a performance. Maybe it could be a path to something healthier, something freer. But those moments were fragile, constantly threatened by the weight of expectation. The comeback also brought new challenges. Paparazzi swarmed again, hungry for evidence of relapse. Every night out became a rumour, every tired expression became a headline. Fans who once begged for privacy now demanded access, dissecting every lyric, every post, every glance for hidden meaning. The internet spun conspiracies about whether the star was truly recovering or just being controlled. The machine pushed them harder, eager to capitalise on the buzz before it faded. It was as if the world had learned nothing from the collapse, repeating the same patterns that had driven them to the breaking point in the first place. But the artist had learned. Scarred and wary, they began to fight back in subtle ways. They pushed for creative control, slipping unfiltered truths into lyrics the label couldn't censor. They demanded breaks, refusing some shows despite management's protests. They began to rebuild relationships on their own terms, cutting out those who had exploited them, seeking out the few who had stayed loyal through the darkest nights. It was a fragile rebellion, but it was a rebellion nonetheless, a sign that the comeback wasn't just about saving a career, but about reclaiming a life. And yet, the cost was immense. Every act of resistance came with consequences, opportunities lost, tension with the label, whispers in the press about being difficult. The machine doesn't like rebellion, especially from those it owns. But the artist was no longer willing to be owned completely. They had seen what compliance led to, and they refused to walk that path again. The comeback then became a battle, not just against public perception, but against the very system that had broken them. Fans, too, were divided. Some celebrated the vulnerability, praising the star for showing strength in imperfection. Others criticised them for not returning to their peak, complaining about weaker performances, shorter sets, cancelled appearances. Compassion was conditional, and the message was clear. As long as you give us what we want, we'll love you. The moment you falter, we'll turn again. That fickleness cut deep, reminding the star that the world's love had never been unconditional. It was always transactional. Through it all, one truth became undeniable. The comeback wasn't about going back to who they once were. That person was gone, shattered by years of pressure, rumours and collapse. The comeback was about becoming someone new, someone who could live with the scars, navigate the machine and maybe, just maybe, find freedom within it. But freedom is never guaranteed. The attempted comeback balanced on a knife's edge. At any moment, another slip, another rumour, another breakdown could send everything crashing again. The star knew it. The fans knew it. The industry knew it. That tension gave the comeback its power, but also its danger. Every triumph felt temporary, every victory precarious. And that's what made the attempted comeback so captivating. It wasn't just about music or fame, it was about watching someone fight for their survival in a system designed to consume them. It was about hope colliding with reality, resilience battling exploitation, humanity struggling against commodification. It was messy, imperfect, fragile, and real in a way no polished image could ever be. For the world, the comeback was entertainment. For the industry, it was profit. But for the star, it was everything. The difference between being consumed and being reborn. And as they stood on stage, staring into the lights once more, the question wasn't whether the comeback would succeed. The question was how long it could last before the cycle began again. Every glittering comeback hides a shadow. And for this artist, the shadow was darker than anything the cameras could capture. The world saw the surface, the triumphant return to stages, the vulnerable songs that climbed charts, the interviews framed as redemption. But behind the curtain, the hidden cost of survival was eating away at them piece by piece. The collapse may have passed, the fallout may have settled, but recovery in the spotlight is never clean, never simple, never free. Every step forward carried scars that would never fully heal, and the price of maintaining the illusion was higher than most people could ever imagine. The first cost was trust. In the wake of collapse, the artist looked around and realised how few people had truly been on their side. The entourage that once felt like family had shrunk. Some had disappeared entirely, retreating when the brand seemed toxic. Others stayed, But their motives were questionable. Were they there out of loyalty or because they still had something to gain? Every conversation became laced with suspicion. Every handshake felt conditional. And though a few loyal friends remained, the circle was tighter, lonelier, and lined with walls. Fame had taught them a brutal lesson. Trust is fragile, and once it breaks, it never comes back the same. The second cost was freedom. On the surface, the comeback seemed to give them more control. Creative decisions, personal boundaries, moments of rebellion against the machine. But every act of defiance came with invisible chains. Labels pushed back subtly, withholding funding or promotion when the star refused to play along. Opportunities vanished without explanation. Media outlets suddenly turned hostile, painting them as difficult, unstable, or ungrateful. Freedom wasn't real. It was conditional, tolerated only as long as it still served the machine. And the star learned that even when you reclaim your voice, the industry finds ways to muffle it. The third cost was health. Fame had already carved deep wounds. Insomnia, anxiety, paranoia, addictions whispered about in tabloids, but never fully confirmed. The comeback didn't erase those wounds. It simply forced them underground. Schedules were lighter than before, but still grueling. Rehearsals less intense, but still exhausting. And the constant scrutiny meant every sign of weakness had to be hidden. Doctors, therapists, even medication became part of the brand management plan. Tools to keep the star functioning, not thriving. They could appear healthy on stage while falling apart backstage, their body and mind pushed to limits the public would never see. Survival had become performance, and performance had become survival. The fourth cost was identity. Years of being packaged, branded, and sold had blurred the line between who they were and who the world thought they were. The comeback demanded vulnerability, confessions wrapped in melodies, interviews filled with honesty. But how much of that honesty was real and how much was scripted? The more they shared, the more the world demanded. Fans wanted raw truth, but only the kind that fit their narrative. Labels wanted authenticity, but only when it could be monetized. The star was trapped in a paradox. Reveal too little, and they were accused of being fake. Reveal too much, and they were devoured. In the end, the line between self and performance blurred so completely that some days they couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The fifth cost was privacy. Fame doesn't give second chances at anonymity. Even during recovery, even during collapse, the cameras never left. Paparazzi lurked outside homes, drones hovered over backyards, strangers snapped photos in restaurants and airports. Every move was public property, every stumble magnified into headlines. And when rumours resurfaced, about relapse, about feuds, about hidden struggles, the star had no power to stop them. Privacy wasn't just gone. It had become a luxury they couldn't buy, no matter how much money or influence they had. The hidden cost of the comeback was knowing they would never truly be left alone. But the deepest cost was invisible, the loss of peace. Even in quiet moments, even when the lights dimmed and the cameras faded, the echoes of the machine lingered. The voices of critics, the betrayal of friends, the weight of fans' expectations, the paranoia of being watched, the fear of collapsing again. Peace had become impossible, replaced by constant vigilance, constant fear, constant awareness that one wrong move could restart the cycle. And living in that state wasn't living at all. It was survival on borrowed time. What made the hidden cost even more tragic was how well it was disguised. To the world, the comeback was a victory. Fans praised their resilience, journalists hailed their artistry, the industry celebrated their profitability. On the surface, it looked like triumph. But behind that image was exhaustion, mistrust, and a hollow sense that no matter how high they climbed, the fall was always waiting. The cost of staying on top wasn't worth it, but stepping away wasn't an option either. Fame doesn't just give, it traps. Once you're in, the machine doesn't let you out easily. And yet, within that cost, there were flashes of truth. The star began to understand that the only way forward wasn't to keep pretending, but to confront the reality of what fame had done. They spoke more openly in private about the trauma, about the betrayals, about the ways the machine had consumed them. They began searching for meaning outside of the stage, small acts of rebellion, quiet moments of connection, glimpses of humanity untainted by cameras. These moments didn't erase the cost, but they made it bearable. For the first time in years, they began to imagine a life not defined entirely by the machine. Still, the scars were permanent. The hidden cost of their rise, their collapse, and their comeback was a life forever shaped by fame's unforgiving hand. They would never be just a person again. They would always be a symbol, a story, a spectacle. And while the world celebrated their resilience, only they knew the truth. Resilience wasn't strength. It was necessity. It was the only way to keep breathing in a world that had turned their existence into a performance. The hidden cost wasn't visible in the lights or the charts. It was written in sleepless nights, in fractured trust, in the quiet moments where they wondered if the fight was worth it. It was a cost they paid every day, and one the world would never understand. Because the world only sees the music, the fame, the comeback. It never sees the toll. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of all. The world demands stars shine, but it never asks what it costs to keep burning. Legacies are strange things. They are never just about the music, the fame, or the awards. They are about the story left behind, the whispers that outlive the spotlight, the way the world remembers you when the noise fades. For this artist, their legacy became defined not only by their talent, but by the scars they carried in public. The pain was undeniable, and yet, so was the power. The same collapse that nearly ended them became part of what immortalized them, and that paradox of destruction giving birth to influence became the defining mark of their story. From the beginning, their career had been painted as meteoric, almost mythic. They weren't just a singer or performer, they were a cultural phenomenon. Their voice, their style, their image shaped entire trends. Fans didn't just consume the music, they absorbed it, wearing the clothes, mimicking the slang, building identities around the aura of their idol. And for a while, that was the legacy people expected: brilliance, reinvention, artistry. But as the cracks began to show, the story shifted. The artist wasn't remembered only for the peaks, they were remembered for the valleys too. The breakdowns, the scandals, the silences, those became inseparable from the art. And in a strange, haunting way, they made the art even more powerful. Because pain, when shared through music, takes on a life of its own. Songs born from sleepless nights and private torment became anthems for millions who recognized themselves in the lyrics. Fans who never set foot on a stage, who never faced the glare of the spotlight, felt understood through verses that spoke of isolation, betrayal, fear, and survival. The star's suffering, once a personal battle, transformed into collective healing. That's the strange alchemy of legacy. What destroys one person can empower countless others, and while the hidden cost was theirs alone to bear, the power of their honesty gave their story a weight that even the industry couldn't erase. But legacies aren't built only by fans. They are shaped by the machine, by the narratives fed to the world long after the artist has stopped speaking. Documentaries reframe their collapse as cautionary tales. Biographies painted their pain as tragic destiny. Tabloids turned struggles into myth, rewriting events to fit dramatic arcs, and through it all, the artist had little control. Their legacy was being shaped while they were still alive, still breathing, still struggling. And though parts of it celebrated resilience and brilliance, other parts commodified the very tragedies that had nearly destroyed them. The machine made sure that even their scars had market value. Yet despite the exploitation, the power of their legacy lay in its authenticity. Unlike so many carefully constructed idols, this artist had bled in public. Their collapse, their comeback, their hidden costs, all of it was visible, undeniable, and raw. And that rawness resonated in ways perfection never could. Fans didn't just admire them, they related to them. The vulnerability made them human in a way most stars never allow themselves to be. And that humanity, fragile and flawed, became the cornerstone of their legacy. It also reshaped the industry. Other artists began to speak more openly about their own struggles, citing this star as the one who broke the silence. Conversations about mental health, exploitation, and fame's dark underbelly gained traction because their story forced people to look. Executives could no longer dismiss the toll of non-stop schedules when the world had seen the consequences. Media outlets, once complicit in tearing stars apart, faced backlash from fans who demanded compassion. The legacy of pain wasn't just personal, It created ripples that changed the cultural conversation. But power is a double-edged sword. The same story that inspired millions also trapped the artist in an identity they didn't fully choose. They became a symbol of struggle, a cautionary tale, an icon of resilience. And while that gave their career a lasting relevance, it also meant they could never escape it. No matter what new art they created, no matter what reinventions they attempted, the world always returned to the collapse, the spiral, the pain. Legacy, once etched, is hard to rewrite. And for them, it was carved in scars. Still, there is something undeniable about how their legacy transcended the chaos. They were no longer just a product of the machine. They were proof of survival in spite of it. They embodied both the cruelty of fame and the strength it takes to endure it. And in that contradiction lay their power. The machine could exploit their collapse, but it couldn't erase the connection they forged with those who saw themselves in their struggle. The media could spin their downfall, but it couldn't stop fans from finding hope in their resilience. The legacy was complicated, but it was theirs. In the years that followed, younger artists often cited them as inspiration, not just for their music, but for their honesty. Fans spoke of how the songs saved them, how the story gave them courage, how the very messiness of their journey made them feel less alone. That was the lasting power. Not the perfection, but the imperfection. Not the polish, but the cracks. The legacy of pain became a legacy of connection, and that connection outlived the scandals, the rumours, the betrayals. Yet for the artists themselves, legacy was a burden. Being remembered for scars meant constantly reliving them. Interviews circled back to the same questions. Articles revisited the same headlines. Even when they tried to move forward, the world dragged them back to the collapse. They couldn't escape their past because the world had built their identity around it. And in private, that weight was crushing. They didn't want to be a symbol. They wanted to be a person. But the world had decided otherwise, and that is the final paradox of their story. The very pain that nearly ended them is what gave their career its immortality. The very collapse that humiliated them became the source of their influence. The very scars they wished to forget became the proof of their power. Legacy doesn't ask permission. It writes itself in the eyes of those who watch, listen, and remember. And for this artist, it wrote a story that was tragic, haunting, inspiring, and unforgettable all at once. The legacy of pain and power isn't a clean story. It's not a fairy tale of downfall and redemption. It's messy, filled with contradictions, shaped by exploitation and resilience, darkness and light. But maybe that's why it endures, because in the end, legacy isn't about being flawless, it's about being unforgettable. And this artist, through every rise and fall, every scar and triumph, ensured that they would never be forgotten. Their legacy wasn't just in the music. It was in the way they forced the world to see the cost of fame. It was in the way they turned suffering into connection. It was in the way they proved that even in the darkest spiral there is still a kind of power. Messy, painful, imperfect, but real. And that kind of legacy doesn't fade. It lingers. It shapes, it warns, it inspires, and it outlives the spotlight. Time has a way of distorting reality, and for this artist, the years following their most turbulent chapters turned their life into something larger than truth itself. What began as rumours during their rise, scandals in their downfall, and whispers during their attempted comeback evolved into myths, stories repeated so often that no one could tell where fact ended and fiction began. These myths became part of their legacy, not because they were true, but because they captured something the world wanted to believe. They became legends, and legends have more power than reality ever does. The first myth was about prophecy. Fans who claimed they had seen it coming pointed to old interviews, cryptic lyrics, and eerie performances where the artist seemed to predict their own collapse. Online forums dissected every line, searching for hidden messages, proof that the artist had been warning the world all along. Some insisted their songs were coded confessions, others swore certain stage outfits contained symbols of rebellion against the machine. None of it was ever confirmed, but that didn't matter. The myth of prophecy gave fans comfort, as though the tragedy had meaning, as though the star had been in control all along. In reality, those so-called signs were the scattered pieces of a person under pressure, but the myth gave them the aura of a visionary. The second myth was about conspiracy. Even years later, debates raged about how much of their collapse was orchestrated. Was it the result of handlers pushing them to exhaustion? Did executives cover up the worst parts to protect profits? Were they silenced during their disappearance, hidden away in facilities against their will? Conspiracies filled the gaps that the star themselves never spoke about, and the less they revealed, the more room the world had to invent. For some, these theories were entertainment. For others, they were gospel truth. And in a twisted way, the conspiracy myths kept the artist alive in cultural memory. They weren't just a performer, they were the centerpiece of an unsolved mystery. The third myth was about salvation. After the attempted comeback, when they stood on stage again, myths sprouted about secret healers, spiritual awakenings, and moments of divine intervention that saved them from destruction. Some claimed they had found religion. Others believed they had joined underground wellness movements. Certain fan communities even treated them like a prophet, a chosen figure who endured suffering for the sake of others. These salvation myths painted the comeback not as resilience, but as transcendence, turning a fragile human struggle into something almost sacred. For many fans, this was the version they chose to believe, because it gave them hope that no amount of darkness could destroy someone entirely. The fourth myth was about betrayal. In whispered stories, villains emerged. Friends who weren't friends, lovers who leaked secrets, managers who manipulated contracts, labels that exploited them to the brink of collapse. Some names were real, others invented, but the narrative stuck. The world loves a story with heroes and villains, and so the myth of betrayal gave people an easy way to explain a tragedy that was far more complicated. These myths also served as warnings. Don't trust the machine, don't trust fame, don't trust the ones who smile too easily. And while the star never confirmed these betrayals, the silence only fueled speculation, solidifying the myths even more. The fifth myth was about immortality. When artists suffer so publicly, they stop being just people. They become symbols. And for this star, myths arose that they could never truly fade, that their influence would last forever, that no scandal, no collapse, no hidden cost could erase their impact. Fans told stories of strangers connecting through their music years later, of their lyrics appearing on protest signs, of their name being whispered by new generations who never saw them live but still felt their presence. The myth of immortality blurred the line between memory and eternity, ensuring they would never be forgotten even long after the spotlight dimmed. But what makes myths powerful is not whether they are true, it's why they exist. Each myth reflected something the world wanted to see. Prophecy myths made the collapse feel less random. Conspiracy myths gave fans someone to blame. Salvation myths turned suffering into inspiration. Betrayal myths fed the hunger for villains. Immortality myths kept hope alive. Together they created a version of the artist that was bigger, louder, and more enduring than the person who actually lived through it all. For the star, these myths were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they cemented their cultural relevance, ensuring their name would echo far beyond their career. On the other, they erased the truth of their experience, replacing it with stories they didn't control. Every time they tried to tell their own version, the myths drowned it out. People didn't want facts, they wanted legends, and so the myths became the reality. Even for those who should have known better, the industry, of course, exploited the myths. Documentaries leaned into conspiracies, dramatizing rumors as though they were evidence. Biopics exaggerated betrayals, painting caricatures of villains to sell tickets. Merchandise capitalized on prophetic lyrics, printing them on shirts as though they were scripture. The machine that once consumed the star now consumed their mythos, ensuring profit long after the actual person had stopped performing. The myths became a new kind of cage, and once again, the artist's life was no longer theirs. And yet, myths have a strange kind of immortality. Unlike headlines that fade or scandals that are forgotten, myths linger, passed from one fan to another, retold in whispers and debates, adapted to fit each new generation's fears and desires. For young fans who discovered the artist long after their collapse, the myths were all they had. They didn't care whether the prophecy was real, whether the conspiracies held truth, whether the betrayals were exaggerated. The myths were the story, and the story was enough. In the end, Section 14 is about this truth. The artist's legacy was no longer just in their songs, their performances, or even their comeback. It was in the myths that outlived them. Myths that turned them into something untouchable, unknowable, and unforgettable. The person who lived, suffered, and struggled may have wanted nothing more than peace, but the legend that grew around them denied it. They became both ghost and god, cautionary tale and inspiration, human and myth. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. In the world of fame, the story you leave behind is rarely the one you lived. There comes a moment in every story where the noise dies down, the camera shut off, and the spotlight fades into something softer, something almost human. For this artist, that moment wasn't marked by an album release or a tour announcement, but by silence. Not the silence of collapse when the world waited breathlessly for their next breakdown. Not the silence of exile when rumours filled the void. This was a different kind of silence, one that came not from being silent but from choosing it. After years of being consumed, repackaged, and turned into myths, they finally sat in the quiet and asked themselves a question they had never been able to face. Who am I when no one is watching? The answer wasn't easy. For so long their identity had been fused with performance. The star was the person, and the person was the star. Every smile, every lyric, every move had been filtered through the lens of expectation. The machine had taught them that worth was measured in numbers, views, sales, awards, headlines, and when those numbers crashed, so did their sense of self. Even in the comeback, even in the redemption arc, they were still playing a role, still meeting a demand, still surviving inside a system that never truly let them breathe. But in the silence of reflection, away from managers and fans and flashing bulbs, they began to peel away the layers. What they found beneath wasn't glamorous, wasn't perfect. It was raw, scarred, and uncertain. But for the first time, it was theirs. The first reflection was on pain. For years they had run from it, numbing it with work, disguising it with image, drowning it out with applause. But pain doesn't vanish when ignored. It embeds itself deeper, waiting for the quiet to resurface. And in that quiet they realized that pain was not just a weakness, but a part of the truth. It was the thing that gave their songs their weight, their story its resonance. Pain had been their curse, but it was also their language, the way they connected with millions who saw themselves in the cracks. Accepting that truth wasn't easy, but it was necessary. To deny the pain was to deny the very thing that made their art matter. The second reflection was on power. For so long, it felt like power belonged only to the machine, the executives, the media, the fans who demanded endlessly. But looking back, they saw something different. Every time they stood on stage, even broken, even trembling, they had held power. Not the kind measured in money or control, but the kind that lived in connection. Power was in the way fans cried during lyrics that mirrored their own struggles. Power was in the way others felt less alone because of their honesty. Power was in surviving it all. When the world had written them off, the machine may have owned the brand, but it could never own the soul of the story. That power, fragile but undeniable, was theirs to keep. The third reflection was on legacy. Legacy had been shaped by myths, rumours, and the narratives others forced upon them. But legacy is not a single story. It is a collage of truths, half-truths, and perceptions. They realised they couldn't control how the world remembered them. People would always argue about what was real, what was fake, what was staged. Some would celebrate them as an icon of resilience. Others would reduce them to a cautionary tale. But in reflection, they saw that legacy wasn't about what others said, it was about what endured. And what endured wasn't the scandals or the conspiracies, it was the music, the art, the moments of connection that outlived the chaos. Legacy was messy, yes, but it was still something they had built with their own hands, even when the world tried to take it away. The fourth reflection was on freedom. Fame had taken so much: privacy, peace, control. And even after the comeback, freedom seemed like a dream always out of reach. But reflection showed them that freedom doesn't come from escaping the machine entirely. It comes from deciding which parts of yourself you refuse to give away. Maybe they could never walk down a street without cameras. Maybe they could never release a song without critics tearing it apart. Maybe myths would always cling to their name, But freedom could still exist in choices. The choice to set boundaries, to step back, to create for themselves instead of the market. Freedom, they realized, was not about disappearing. It was about reclaiming the parts of themselves that fame had tried to erase. The fifth reflection was on survival. People called them resilient, strong, unstoppable. But survival never felt heroic. It felt exhausting. It felt like crawling through fire just to breathe again. And yet, looking back, they saw that survival itself was a form of rebellion. The machine expected stars to burn out completely, to collapse and be replaced. But they hadn't disappeared. They hadn't surrendered entirely. They were still here, scarred but standing. Survival wasn't glamorous, but it was proof of life, proof that they were more than a product, more than a myth, proof that even when broken, they were unbreakable in ways the world could never understand. But perhaps the deepest reflection was this. Fame had given them everything and taken everything in return. It had lifted them to heights they never imagined, then dragged them into depths most people wouldn't survive. It had made them a symbol, a spectacle, a commodity, and finally a myth. But through it all, beneath the noise and the chaos, there had always been a person. And in the end, that person mattered more than the star. Reflection wasn't about rewriting the story or escaping the past. It was about finally seeing the difference between the two. So in the final reflection, they made peace, not with the machine, not with the myths, but with themselves. They acknowledged the pain, embraced the power, accepted the legacy, defined their own freedom, and honored their survival. It didn't erase the scars, it didn't silence the rumors, but it gave them something the world could never take away, a sense of self that belonged only to them. The cameras would flash again, the myths would spread again, the machine would always loom. But for the first time, they weren't defined entirely by those things. They were defined by the choice to live beyond them. And in that quiet, in that reflection, they found a kind of victory the world would never fully understand. Because the final reflection wasn't about fame. It wasn't about collapse, comeback, or legacy. It was about humanity. And in the end, that humanity, scarred, imperfect, but real, was the truest story they had ever told. Every story has an ending, but not every ending brings closure. For this artist, the journey we've traced, through rise and collapse, through myths and redemption, through pain and power, doesn't resolve neatly into a fairy tale. Fame doesn't allow fairy tales. It allows survival. It allows spectacle. It allows profit, but it rarely allows peace. And yet, in the quiet corners beyond the headlines, in the fragile silences away from the stage, they found something far more valuable than perfection. Truth. The truth was that fame had devoured them, stripped them, and turned them into a product. The truth was that their collapse wasn't weakness, but a human reaction to being pushed beyond human limits. The truth was that the comeback was never about returning to who they once were, but about becoming someone new, someone who could stand despite the scars. And the truth was that their legacy, as messy and painful as it was, carried power far beyond the spotlight. Because what people remembered most wasn't the scandals or the conspiracies. It was the way their voice cracked on stage, the way their lyrics spoke what so many felt but couldn't say, the way their very survival made others believe they could survive too. That's the paradox of their story. The world that almost destroyed them also immortalized them. Every betrayal, every rumor, every headline carved scars into their life, but those same scars became symbols of connection. Their pain became other people's language, their collapse became other people's warning, their comeback became other people's hope. And that is the lasting power of a story like this. It stops belonging to just one person. It becomes a mirror for everyone who sees themselves in it. But as we reflect on their journey, we're left with uncomfortable questions. How many more stars will be consumed by the same machine? How many more collapses will be packaged as entertainment? How many scars sold as stories? How many human beings reduced to cautionary tales? Fame is seductive, but it is ruthless. And this artist's story, as unforgettable as it is, reminds us that behind every chart-topping single and viral headline is a person who bleeds, who breaks, who longs for peace just like anyone else. In the end, the conclusion isn't about the downfall or the comeback. It isn't about the myths or the legacy. It's about perspective. It's about learning to see past the spectacle, to recognize the humanity behind the performance. Because if there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that survival in the spotlight is never simple, never painless, and never guaranteed. But survival itself, imperfect, fragile, defiant, is powerful. And so the final note of their story isn't tragedy, and it isn't triumph. It's something far more complicated, something real. It's the acknowledgement that even in the harshest glare of fame, even when consumed by the machine, even when turned into myth, the human beneath still matters. And that truth, the truth of scars, survival, and self, is what will echo long after the lights go out.